right, crew. Well, let's get this thing rolling. So, my name is Jordan. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'll let these lovely ladies introduce themselves, and then we'll handle topic next. But go ahead, ladies.
Cool. Well, I am the sequence specialist at Outreach. My name is Meghan Donovan. I've been with the company for a little over 3 years, so I'm well versed in outreach content.
Glad to have you here.
And I'm Erika. I lead our content services department at Greaser Consulting, and we do work for teams about content creation and content strategy.
All right. Well, hey, glad to have you both here. Just a heads up for all. I said I'm Jordan. I'm from Greaser Consulting as well, and I'm going to be the functional moderator. This is a joint webinar today between the Sales Hacker crew, me over here at Greaser Consulting, and we're going to focus on how to create sales plays, sales sequences that reps will actually use. Obviously, there's a huge buzz around this on LinkedIn. There's a ton of chatter about writing content that sticks, personalization at scale, and the common frustration among enablement folks that we spend a lot of time, resources, etc., on writing content, and now nobody uses it. So that's what we're tackling today. So first thing, let's start with Meghan, right? Coming from the mothership Outreach that you're coming from, how do you create a sequence that will never be used by a sales rep?
Well, we try obviously to create content that is used by the sales rep. And the biggest part of that is obviously rep buy-in and listening to what the front line is hearing and what they need. So we do that in a few ways at Outreach. The first way is we have a Google form that we share with all of our SDRs that allows them to suggest content that they want made, or maybe content that needs to be updated. But that's one outlet for our reps to keep them engaged in our content process. The second is internally, we've created a team called the Content Review Crew. And this crew is made up of either top performing SDRs, SDRs that are really well versed in writing emails, or SDRs that are just really good with candid feedback. We meet with them on a monthly basis, and they typically will review all content before it's rolled out to the team. And we kind of treat that review crew like cheerleaders. So they kind of, get the SDR org excited about the content and helps with buy-in so that the reps actually use the content that I'm creating.
So when we say, what shouldn't you do, it sounds like everything you're saying is you should not listen, right? You're talking about putting a content committee together, getting some process together. Erika, again, we're just setting the stage here, this whole webinar. You got any knots right out of the gate?
Yeah, I think when you leave reps out of the content creation process, you're drastically limiting the chances that they're really going to use and adopt it well. So I know, and especially, it's the last day of a lot of quarters right now, last day of the month. And I know salespeople, a lot of times it's hard to get time with them. And that's something that we hear a lot from clients that we work with is, hey, we can't pull salespeople off the phone in order to have them edit this content. So you're just going to have to do it without them. And we say, absolutely not. That's not going to work as long as you care about adoption, which you should if salespeople are on the phone trying to get meetings. And so I think leaving reps out of the sales process or the sales content creation process is a huge miss. And a lot of times that's not intuitive for people. So that's something that we spend a lot of time educating people on to say, hey, we have to involve your reps. They don't have to write the content. They don't have to even spend a ton of time. And one thing that I think is actually really helpful in getting reps to kind of volunteer their time is to promise them that they won't have to do anything outside of that call. Because a lot of times when reps speak their mind, they think like, oh, that might lead to more work for me, and I don't want to take on any more responsibility because I want to sell. So if you say, hey, I can set up a call with you and you can look at the content and just roast it for 30 minutes, tell me everything you hate about it, and then we'll go on the back end and we'll do all the work. That's how you really get reps to be involved and to actually sort of be forthcoming and how much feedback they give. So not involving them is a huge miss. I think also kind of creating content and then not reviewing it is also a big miss, because a lot of times reps will say, yeah, we like this sequence, and then you'll look in outreach in a month or two and no one's used it, and you said, hey, wait a second, you said you liked this and now you're not using it, so what happened? So I think just kind of trusting that everything is going to go according to plan and just not reviewing the content, both the adoption as well as the performance, that's a big miss, because a lot of times too, reps will send out content and won't maybe perform as well as you'd expect, but you might not know that if you're not reviewing it, and so you might have a big miss there. So not reviewing it on a regular basis. And then the last thing would be, if you're spending a lot of time in either marketing or sort of in your rev ops department in general creating content, and at the same time you give reps permission to also create content, a lot of times reps won't even look at the content that you make. And so just being really mindful of your permission settings and really understanding what you're incentivizing reps to do, I think is important. So just having some kind of quality assurance process is important. So Jordan, to phrase it negatively, like you asked me to, I think not having a quality assurance process for rep created content is a big miss.
Well, I think this puts actually Meghan in a really good place here, like related to the evolution of outreach, right? So back in the day, we're hearing you got to have people involved, you got to roast, you got to whatever. Outreach was a startup, is a startup. I'm not real sure what to even say these days, right? And over time, it's evolved from, and I can speak from experience, 2 guys on a Saturday writing sequences for the whole organization. All right, that was my experience with a guy named Alex Lynn back in the day. To now, there's this whole process, and then there's companies that are, thousands of people in size that are dealing on some of these issues. So, Meghan, I'd love to hear how that sort of iteration process and involving reps has changed over time at Outreach, just as the company has even grown. And by the way, crew, don't be afraid. Put your comments, questions in the chat here, and we'll bring them up. But Meghan, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of touched on the content review crew before, but something that's really important as far as like working for a company that, has 1,000 employees like Outreach is currently, I can't just roll out whatever content that I see fit, right? So the content, new content need to be bought in by many people within the SDR org before I actually create it. So for example, we need buy-in from SDR management. We need buy-in from our VP of business development. And we need buy-in from our content review crew. We also, because our SDR org is so big, we segment our content in multiple different ways. So we segment by market segment, prospect persona, situation, whether our outreach to the prospect is cold or warm. So our SDR org currently utilizes over 100 sequences, whereas a smaller org could operate successfully with, let's say, 10 or 15.
So what makes you decide, I'm going to stay with you for a second, Meghan. What makes you decide, well, we're ready to move beyond 10 or 15, right? Like it's time to go to do more, to do different things.
Yeah, so I think that when we're breaking into the different verticals, again, just a generic sales leadership isn't going to necessarily do it if we're trying to break into other industries outside of SaaS and tech, where we seem to use like the same phrases, where breaking into like banking, logistics definitely require different messaging than, our core base sequences we started with. So really just outgrowing those, and we'll hear that from the SDR team a lot in their content requests, is, hey, this doesn't necessarily fit in our situation. We need something that's a little bit more targeted. Messaging is a little bit different here. So really listening to the team and understanding their needs helps me know, when we're ready to create more content.
Okay. And I'd imagine, and I'm going to bring this over to Erika, I'd imagine part of this equation too is like, well, sure, maybe we do need 50 sequences, but do we actually have the capability and bandwidth to do it? So Erika, I'd love to hear, I know, right, with the companies that we work with over here at Greaser is we're working from these small startups with 5 people all the way to the behemoths in the space, right? So I'm curious to hear, like, who are you engaging with on those different layers? And then on top of that, what's the capability and capacity that you're seeing when you're jumping into these different types of organizations?
Jordan, when you say who we're engaging with, do you mean like different titles or personas within the companies?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing, just to kind of talk about the difference between what a sequence creation strategy would look like at a large enterprise company versus a small startup, I think it's not always obvious that all large companies or all small companies have similar strategies. One of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years is that sales tech sophistication is the most important thing to think about. And what we found sometimes is that it's actually counterintuitive. So you have sort of like small or medium-sized startups that have a very, very sophisticated tech stack because they need to be really efficient with their revenue systems, where you have these large enterprise companies that have developed their revenue strategy without really thinking about sales engagement or sales enablement at all. And it's a huge change management project to try to get anything through in the bigger companies. And so the strategy for creating content systems is really different, not always by company size, but really by the sophistication of your tech stack. If you already have like a really lean tech stack and you already have process adoption, I mean, it's just as simple as going in, establishing a content supply chain, assigning ownership to it, and then just setting deadlines, right? I think headcount is a big issue. And just really understanding what your bandwidth is, I think, is the hardest part. Most of the teams that we work with, they have like one sales ops person that's doing sales engagement, sales enablement. They're working with marketing. They've got so many hats, and they're also, by the way, in charge of enablement and training. And at a certain point, when you get to the point where you have 100 active sequences that are not superfluous, but are actually like really necessary based on your process sophistication, I mean, I think you need one person to write and measure your content versus like one person that's doing everything sales enablement related. So I think, to summarize, Jordan, I would say a thing that small and large companies would have in common is that establishing bandwidth and ownership, I think, is the most important first step. And then in terms of how they're different, would just be sort of the layers of automation, how much proprietary technology you have. I mean, that's all important stuff to consider before you do like the fun stuff.
So you just use that phrase, content supply chain, right? We got to figure out the content supply chain. So anyway, the question I have for you is, could you define what do you mean by content supply chain? So that's the question for Erika. And then Meghan, where I'm going with this is, what does that content supply chain look like at Outreach today, right? You've touched on it a little bit, but that whole scope that Erika's talking about. So could you define that for us, Erika?
Yeah, so I think the problem that we find in most companies that we start working with is that they have a lot of ambition to have a really robust sales content strategy. So they want messaging that their salespeople can use with their sales engagement platform. And it's kind of an aside of a lot of different people's jobs. So like marketing gets thrown in, sales reps get thrown in, maybe the sales manager gets thrown in. So when we ask what should be a really simple question, which is, hey, who's writing your sequences? They're like, I don't know, they're tagged by the name of who wrote them, and it's like, oh gosh. And so I think establishing a content supply chain just means, you take your go-to-market strategy, you take sort of the activities that your end users are doing, and you connect those two dots by assigning ownership to every step along the way. So you know exactly who's responsible for what, when, and also so that you account for the entire life cycle of that content. So someone has to sort of get the idea, someone has to approve that idea, idea, someone has to create it, someone has to do it, someone has to put it in your sales engagement platform to make sure it's sort of formatted correctly and that it works. Someone has to measure adoption, someone has to measure performance, someone has to make sure that all the technical stuff runs smoothly, and then at some point someone has to decide whether or not to retire that content or to reiterate. Are you A/B testing? How are you managing that? How are you documenting learning? And so obviously I could keep talking, but I'm going to pause for a second and let Meghan talk. But I think clearly it's more steps and more work than a lot of people understand when they say, hey, let's build more content. It's more than just like one step.
And we know, Meghan, like you're coming out of outreach here, right? The big thought from everybody is, well, how does outreach use outreach? The most commonly phrased question everybody hears. So when you hear, just the sort of wide array of everything that Erika's saying, I mean, this is the question that's on everybody's mind. Well, yeah, these sound like big problems. How does outreach do it for outreach? Is that you, or is it also involving, this plethora of different people that you're sort of hurting along the way?
So it's a combination of both. As far as the ideas, a lot of those ideas for content, again, do come from our frontline reps. The suggestion comes from them. I run it by our SDR managers, our VP of business development, to make sure there's an actual use case there, that there's not anything similar already existing in our library. I do manage all SDR content, so I pretty much am already familiar with what's already out there. At that point of everybody giving thumbs up, then it's kind of up to me to create. Once it's created, it's sent to all of the SDR managers, so all market segments, all managers, all team leads, our VP of business development. I typically include our inbound sales content person as well to get their insight and feedback. And then again, that content review crew that I keep talking about is huge as well. So I truly manage the majority of our content supply chain at Outreach, outside of marketing and then any inbound content. So it is up to me also to monitor that sequence performance and that content performance.
So this brings us, and Meghan, we'll just hang tight with you a second, right? The reason everybody's here, you got that content supply chain in place. You're doing a ton of work. Everyone's hustling about it. But what makes for good content? What are the key themes? What are the key things we have to know? Everyone's talking about personalization. What does that even mean? Is that good content? Just want to get some base level thoughts there.
Yeah, we definitely go by persona based personalization. That's like the number one way our sequences are broken down at Outreach. Personalization it's not, always writing an email from scratch. That's definitely not the most efficient way for your reps to personalize. We typically coach our reps in the first 2-3 sentences of the email, grab a key personalization about the prospect, the company, the business, to show that you've actually done the research before you've reached out to the prospect and you know what you're saying is relevant to that prospect. Past those first couple sentences of personalization, we typically have the rest of the email templated with persona pains or our pitches, and then a call to action at the end. So to answer your question, personalization for us, it's typically, light personalization, make sure the prospect is engaged, briefly explain why you're reaching out and what that personalization has to do, tie it back in with each other, and then tie it up with the ask.
Is this every email that's sent, or is this like a certain, people are sort of moving away from saying tier 1, tier 2, but sort of in ICP versus out of ICP. Is everyone getting the same type of messaging, or are the sequences even designed a little differently depending?
Yeah, so our base sequences are really ICP related. So we're using a lot of the panes that we have in a SaaS company as well. And then we take those same persona panes, tweak the messaging to then have outside of ICP. So, like I talked about before, logistics, banking, all of those, the terminology that's a little different, but taking those same persona panes and kind of just tweaking from there rather than starting from scratch to be, as efficient as possible.
So, Erika, you're coming from the consulting company background. You're hearing how outreach is doing outreach, right? My question to you is there anything that you're hearing here that you're saying, well, when we engage, we actually do it a little differently? Or are you like, hey, whatever Megan's saying, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think everything Megan is saying makes sense to me. Totally makes sense. Wouldn't disagree with anything. I think a couple things that I would add that are kind of general, right? Just across the board. And even when we go in and we do something like an audit of someone's content, before we even look at the outreach instance, I can already say to someone, hey, I bet these two things are going to be pieces of feedback that I have. And the first two things would be make it short. I know outreach recommends, like, if you can't read the whole thing on a phone screen before you scroll, like, it's too long, and I repeat that all the time. And another thing too is, like, if you can cut something without losing value, cut it. If an email is one sentence, two sentences, fine. But I always try to, like, when we're creating content, one of the things I train our team on is I say, okay, write the sequence and then just don't look at it for a couple days, and then go back to it and look at it again, because your brain will just see the extra pieces and you can just cut. And that's my favorite part of the writing process, is just throwing away the excess that shouldn't be there. And we've done large scale audits of enterprise organizations where we've actually found that their like the emails that didn't pass our brevity test got like half the amount of responses that we would have expected based on the other sequences in their instance. And we did a little bit of a calculation, and we're like, oh, you could actually increase your pipeline by millions if you just cut half the content in some of these sequences. And that I thought was a pretty interesting finding. So making your content as short as makes sense. We usually say like 3 paragraphs, kind of like Megan was saying, right? There's sort of a more personalized, or at least personalized, feel to the first paragraph. Then you sort of have a value proposition, and then you have a call to action. You shouldn't need more than that. So 3 paragraphs, and if you're in like an inbox or something, like 2 lines or 3 lines maximum, but I feel much more comfortable with 2 lines for the most part maximum. So we're talking really short emails. And then the other thing that's pretty common feedback that we give is, hey, this email is about you and not your customer, and it should be about the customer completely. So if you're starting the email and you're talking about features and benefits of the thing that you're selling, you're doing it wrong. You shouldn't. And in most cases, we don't even say the name of the company or the product. This is where it sort of depends on the stage. We work with a lot of companies that are just hiring their first SDR team, and they're trying to get their name out there. And so that's kind of a different story. But, everyone kind of knows where you're coming from because of your email signature and your email. And so a lot of times you don't need to say like, hey, I'm with outreach, because it's obvious and people probably know outreach. So those are the 2 things that I think are good. The last thing I would say that I say often, especially internally, is using really simple language. Kind of explain it like you would explain it to your grandfather. Like, what is it that you do? Get as simple as possible. And on our team, one thing that we like to do in our creation process is, because we get to know different people's products and teams. And so we say, hey, I did this discovery with this team and I wrote this sequence. Do you understand it? Like, if you just got this cold in your inbox, would you be able to understand what they do enough to just spend 30 minutes learning more about it? And if I read something and I'm like, hey, I know this is some sort of like AI tech that's complicated, but I have no idea what it does after reading an email, like, we need to go back and we need to make it simple. Because even if you're talking to someone who knows a lot, you're sending a cold email. Like, if it takes more than a couple seconds for someone to figure out what in the world you're talking about, you've already lost them. And so you need like a very, very simple language in your emails too. And that's, if those 3 things are all hit, it's probably a good email.
Yeah, and
go ahead, Megan. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. To actually follow up on Erika's point, that was something that came to mind as well. Information overload. Like, stay away from that, because your prospect is just going to shut down. It's going to require too much thinking on their part to understand where you're going and what you're trying to say, and you're not going to get a response. So just to your point, stay away from information overload as well, because it's putting too much on the prospect.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties, Jordan, back to one of your questions, which is how do you know when you need more than 10 sequences? A lot of times, especially when a team is just investing in something like outreach, the temptation is just to put all of their information into one outbound sequence. And what we try to tell them is we say, hey, look, you have basically like a storyline here. You have 5 value propositions, put one of those in each email in the sequence, and then you probably have 2 or 3 outbound sequences here. And if you just hyper focus on specific value propositions, it's going to be more compelling, and you're going to have more content that your reps can choose from depending on what they know about the prospect. And so I think information overload is a huge issue, and I don't think people always feel comfortable spreading out their information across time because they think, oh, I only have this one shot. But that's kind of a fine balance to find, I think.
For sure.
So I'm gonna go off script here for a second and ask this question. Right, we got a ton of good opinions on here's what's good, here's why it's good, all of that. We know Outreach recently rolled out this huge reporting package inside of the software, right, that does all this sentiment tracking. So Megan, I'm super curious, is there anything that, like, prior to that being rolled out, like, and this isn't to throw Outreach under the bus, this is like content writers in general, that we're like, no, like, don't put first name in the subject line, or something, like some like real specific piece of feedback that now that we have all this sentiment data that's coming in and we're checking, like, was that all confirmed? Were we right? Or is it like, oh, actually, after looking at this, here's what needs to change?
Yeah, so it's funny you bring that up, because that kind of came into play with our breakup emails. So we had breakup emails in a few of our sequences, and prior to positive sentiment, you are going off of the reply rate. So while the replies looked like, the breakup email was performing and, doing what it was meant to do, elicit a response, once we dug into positive sentiment, all of those responses were negative responses. So without that reporting functionality, we wouldn't have been able to see that outside of doing really manual work, which is literally going one by one into every single response we got on that breakup email. So positive sentiment has been huge for us. It truly allows us to see what the prospects and what our customers are saying, how many of those responses are positive, and then how many are objections, and then goes a layer deeper and actually buckets your objections as well. So at the end of the quarter, we can see like a lot of pricing objections, and preemptively, so we can look at, last year, Q3, seeing a lot of pricing objections and a lot of timing pushes, and preemptively, I can look at that data, kind of prepare content for us to overcome it this year, because we already know it's coming.
So the big shift was breakup emails, right?
Yes, breakup email.
That's the big shift.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the sort of content supply chain. We've talked about what makes a good email, right? We're talking about some of the different ways that reporting go into it. Actually, somebody just brought us into the chat here. So do you recommend breakup emails, right? I want to make sure our audience gets a chance to speak before I do. So at the end of the day, do you totally disregard them, or do you actually recommend them in some scenarios still?
The second, definitely. Breakup emails have a time and a place, but they definitely don't belong in every sequence. If the prospect has never interacted with your emails, sending them a breakup email could potentially help your reps save some time if there isn't a use case or any interest from that prospect. As far as breakup emails, remind them what issues your solution helps with. Don't be pushy, and then kind of treat it as a win-win situation. So as long as you give me a response here, you say you're not interested, I maybe try to handle an objection or two, I'll let it go because clearly there's no interest in this outreach. So also making it clear to them that this is the last time you'll be contacting them and kind of leaving the ball in their court. So if your reps truly aren't going to reach out to this prospect for a while, it could potentially help them save time in the long run. So to answer your question, I do recommend breakup emails in certain situations, but I do think there's a right and a wrong way to do that. So just making it very clear, you're not being pushy. It's totally fine if you're not interested. Just trying to elicit a response so that your reps aren't spending time on, prospects that aren't going anywhere.
Yeah, another thought that I would have to sort of tack on there, and this is, I think, why it's really important to establish your content supply chain and sort of your what your life cycle is going to be for prospecting before you start creating a content strategy is, you don't want to lie in an email. And one of the things we've come across with teams is we've said, okay, you have a breakup email here that says, this is the last time I'll be reaching out. But then you're instructing your SDR team 2 weeks later to just put them in sort of a next sequence. And so I think, one of the kind of default breakup emails that we recommend is saying something like, hey, it's clear that right now isn't the best time. I'll leave the ball in your court for now, but looking forward to picking up a conversation in the future, rather than I think a more 2 or 3 years ago, I think I saw a lot of emails that were like, hey, are you under a rock? Or what's going on? I'm really worried about you. And I think those were kind of fun, the first time you got them. And then after a while, it started to have the opposite effect where someone's like, okay, unsubscribe. Or, if you tell someone hey, this is the last time I'll contact you, and then they hear from you in a couple weeks, that doesn't really make sense to them. So I think just making sure that whatever you say in that sort of final email of the sequence, it aligns with what you're instructing your teams to do. I think that's super, super important, just to make sure those are aligned.
All right, so we're talking about sort of optimizing the content in a way here, and I think Amy is asking a question in the chat that I just love, right? Is, can you speak a little to perfecting the content ahead, or basically ahead of time, versus allowing A/B testing to accelerate the process? And the reason why I love this question is what we find over and over and over again is folks are like, all right, I've got a sales engagement platform. I can finally write content, and there's a huge effort to get it in. And then what happens, right? Where's the iteration on the back end? So I love this question. So if either one of you two, whoever wants to take it, go for it. Do you perfect it first right out of the gate? What's that process look like versus we're just going to get it in and we're going to A/B test really fast?
So personally, I'm a big fan of A/B testing before implementation. To your point, everybody on LinkedIn seems to be an influencer these days and have insight into what good content looks like. Before taking any of those suggestions I see on LinkedIn, we typically always A/B test to ensure that that resonates with us in our market segments, the people we're reaching out to, and just really make sure that we have the data behind rather than just an idea. And that's truly what it is before you have the actual data. So for me, I'm big in A/B testing, but interested to hear your thoughts here, Erika.
Yeah, I love this question. I think, and this isn't a very scientific question, but I'll just answer it the way that is honest. when I'm in editing sessions, sorry, not a very scientific answer. I think I said not a very scientific question. I got too excited. I think like when I'm in an editing session with a content committee, let's say there's like an SME that's maybe a product marketer, there's an account executive or an SDR that's actually the end user, um, and maybe there's also someone on there that's like a program manager for outreach, right? So it's like a whole group of people that all have sort of different lenses. And if we're still going back and forth about like how to talk to this persona, we're still going back and forth about what stat to use. Like those are things that you should have consensus on before you send a sequence. That's how I feel. So I will sit in that editing session until we say, okay, it actually makes a lot of sense to talk to the persona this way, to use this stat, to lay out the value propositions in this order in this sequence. And if you can absolutely not agree on something after, let's say like a 30-minute meeting or an hour-long meeting editing this sequence, that's a good A/B test because you have sort of differing opinions internally. If you can agree on everything, and maybe you have an AE that says, oh, I like to say thanks in advance instead of best, and that's an A/B test. Like don't try to work that out before you actually send the sequence. So it's kind of about the different opinions that you might have internally, how significant they are, and how much you can actually get to a consensus internally before. And the more voices you have represented in that group, the more likely it is that's a really good place to start. If you're one person sending a sequence, I think it's much harder to understand where that line is. So my feedback there would just be to have more eyes on it and get it to a point where you can have a consensus, and then you start A/B testing. And on A/B testing, just A/B test one thing at a time. I think that's super, super important. I think a lot of times people who have that question, they just kind of say, okay, I'm just going to kind of throw up 3 or 4 threads for every single email, every email step in the sequence, and then you don't really understand what you're testing. So making sure your tests are really isolated, that's where it gets scientific. I think that's a super important next step.
So we know it needs to happen, right? But Meghan, how often are you iterating? So Molly just put a question in and saying, Erika says only do one A/B test at a time, right? I think there's a whole connotation behind what that even means. But for your side, Meghan, and we'll let Erika, I set you up there, Erika, we'll let you respond to that. But Meghan, like how often are you iterating? How much? If you got 100 sequences, how many are being iterated at a time?
So I'm looking at our content dependent on use case situation, either quarterly or twice a year to make sure all of that content is up to date. As far as A/B tests go, we typically do like 5 A/B tests over all of our sequences and kind of manage that on a biweekly meeting with our data science team as well. And I keep eyes on that. I do all of the recording on that, on a biweekly basis.
And that's across all your sequences?
Yes, we run about 5 at a time through all of our sequences. We try to put the most sequences we can in an A/B test to try to, again, field, does this resonate in all of our market segments? Is it resonating in all of our personas? And really trying to get as much data as we can, as quick as we can, so that we can implement those changes.
So you hear Meghan's response. Erika, what does iterate one thing at a time mean to you, right? Because it sounds like Meghan's busy. Sounds like we're on holiday. What's the scoop?
Well, I think testing one thing and running one A/B test are 2 completely different concepts, right? So when I say test one thing at a time, you could run a single A/B test. Let's say I want to test whether or not adding a link to the email affects deliverability, which is a great A/B test to run, right? And so you could run that single A/B test in multiple emails within a sequence or across multiple sequences in a similar email in a similar position in the sequence. And in fact, I think for a lot of teams, that have a hard time getting a large send volume quickly, testing the same variable across multiple sequences is a really smart way to get data faster. Because you're trying to get to 500 sends, let's say, and that might take some teams 2 months with one sequence just because their volume is so low. It could be one person that's sending this to and personalizing a lot, versus some other teams where they have people put 50 to 60 people in a sequence every day, that you're going to get that much faster. And so you can have multiple tests going, but what I mean when I say you have to isolate that variable, just to go back to the scientific perspective, you want to make sure that your question is really precise. So instead of saying something like, which of these subject lines works best, and having just like different subject lines, you might want to say something like, does having a 3-word subject line versus a 7-word subject line affect open rates? And is that the thing that affects open rates? And so you might choose to really test, different phrases, but also the length of the subject line to see if that affects it. Because otherwise you might say, okay, great, this subject line wins. But then when you're creating new content or you're trying to scale, you don't actually have a set of best practices that you've gleaned. You just have a bunch of one-off test results. And so that's the important thing about variable isolation, is that you actually get really meaningful data from that you can then use when you create new content.
So I want to make sure we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A, but we want to do one more topic here before we go, and that's on the topic of adoption. Now, Meghan, I think you're going to have an interesting perspective because you're at the mothership, thinking about adoption, right? But we just had a call with a potential customer yesterday, and the guy was exasperated. He says, "Oh my goodness. We're getting a 45.8% open rate, a 26% reply rate. We're getting a positive sentiment of 39%, and we have below 50% adoption across the org, right? Like wild, crazy, like great numbers. You think everyone would be going nuts, and we're still running into an adoption issue. So this whole vein is, okay, we can understand if the content's no good, why there's an adoption issue, right? But whenever we're even performing well, I mean, what has to be done in these organizations for adoption to truly occur? Is it as easy as write the content and just ship it out? So Meghan, I can see like you got the wind is in your lungs right now. You're ready to go. So shoot for it.
I wish it was that easy. I think the biggest thing here is communication. So really engaging with the teams you are creating this content for. So for me, it's the SDR team. So I'm meeting with the SDR team as a whole on a weekly basis to share and remind them of recent content I've made. SDRs are so busy, and again, there's so much content out there. It does take, more than once, twice, sometimes 3, 4, 5 times reminding them that, hey, I've created this great piece of content. It's really high performing and you should utilize that. Breaking it down a layer further too and making it real to the SDR as far as what this could mean for IMs booked, pipeline, and just making that a real number, because they're sales reps and they're typically money driven. So that seems to work. Staying engaged in the SDR Slack channel, where I will consistently send direct links to the content. And then as a fail-safe, each month I look at the content that was made and created that month. And if I can see that it hasn't been utilized or is being underutilized, I will start to push that content again. But truthfully, because we are engaging our reps from the very beginning and asking them consistently, what are you hearing? What do you need? It's not as hard as it has been in the past because we're involving them so much in the process from the very beginning.
So Meghan, you're primarily the SDR world, and it sounds like it's about education, communication, staying on top of the ball. And making sure what really works is just like, maybe they missed it in their email. Maybe they're like focused on the end of the month, so they'll start that next week, right? Like, so that's the goal. Erika, I'm going to ask you a loaded question around AE world, CSM world, but specifically AE world. At one point, I spent every week flying around and training AEs on how to use outreach. Okay, that was like part of the job. And the common situation was the AEs would say, they'd say something to the extent of, I don't want to use this content because I want to write my own content. And then, we'd all say, well, that's probably a bad idea. Like, here's why. And they said, no, I'm not going to use. So then the org sort of cedes and goes, okay, we'll let the AEs create their content. And then, surprise, surprise, no one actually creates it, or you get like one step sequences. And you're like, well, shoot, like we gave you permission, but you didn't use it. But if we don't give you permission, you're also saying you're not going to use it. So, Erika, like, how do you capture the mind of an AE or the heart of an AE? Is it the same process that you go after an SDR, or is it different?
Yeah, great question. So kind of a two-part answer. One, I think it helps to have personal experience, right? I use my personal story a lot when I'm working with AEs. And a lot of times, especially when a sales engagement platform is new, they've had like Salesforce and Outlook for the last 10, 20 years. And they're like, what is this thing? This is a marketing tool. And so it's really helpful when I can come in and say, like, look, I was an SDR at an organization that used this and also made it, by the way, but used it. And then I was an AE at a different organization that didn't use it. And I was so much less efficient. And it's not because I was trying to SDR in my AE role, but it's because this is a full sales cycle tool that's not only good for SDRs to book meetings, but also really helpful for account executives to have more conversations with more people and spend less time doing manual work. So I said, hey, if you're using spreadsheets and if you're still managing your time on Outlook calendar with little reminders to contact your prospects, you need this. So it's selling, essentially what I just said is really just selling it with my personal experience, I think is very helpful. And then to Megan's point, doing education. I think education, obviously outside of outreach, is a little bit different because everyone in outreach is like trained from the very beginning on what it is and how to use it. And so people that haven't heard of it before, I think it's still really new. I think it's easy to forget since we're so immersed in the sales engagement space. I think it's really easy to forget that to a lot of people, this is still like, isn't that a CRM or isn't that like Marketo? Like, what is this thing? And so I think we do a lot of really sort of level one education about this is a sales engagement platform. This is who can use it. And this is why, your company has invested so much money in this thing is because it actually can help you. So framing it as a full sales cycle tool, which it is, I think is really important. And then another thing that I run into a lot that we spend a lot of time in a change management process with is, there's technology and then there's your process. And I think a lot of times people buy technology and then they say, okay, now what is our process going to be with this new technology? And that's stressful for reps, especially senior AEs who have had their process and it's been working for them for a long time. But now to say, okay, it's not enough to do things like you have been because your competition is using this and they're going to start being more efficient. And so it's necessary for you also to adopt this and to help them see that they can adopt the technology to their process. So their process doesn't actually have to change. It's more that when they understand the features and how to configure a platform so that it supports what they're already doing, that's when I see AEs especially have an aha moment. They're like, wait, you can create generic tasks? Like, what? I can create a fully manual sequence? Like, why didn't anyone tell me that? And I think because the business case is often built around like sort of getting rid of manual activity. And that's a really important part. But I think all like the business case for AEs is often the reverse, which is you can still have manual control over your messaging. And so the selling adoption to AEs is a little bit different.
So that feels like, webinar 2.0 is, outreach sequence or sales loft, whatever SCP sequence beyond prospecting, right? Like what does that world look like? And man, I'd sign up for that one. But with that, we have a couple minutes left. I think Megan and Erika have done a great job of just, pounding the information, through this call. I do want to open it up for Q&A. We have a couple that have come in, so if anybody else, as I'm speaking here, you're thinking of questions, now is the time. So we have Larry here asking the question. Larry says, got it, regarding content for an email. What are some examples on changing the content to then create a sequence? So anybody want to tackle that question here?
I'm going to let Erika take that one.
Yeah. Well, the way that I understand this question is saying, okay, I get, what it looks like to have a good email sort of template within a sequence, but what necessarily do you need to keep in mind when you're kind of stringing emails together? So, Larry, let me know if I misunderstood that question, but that seems like what you're asking. And one of the things I would say is kind of changing up the different styles of email. So, for example, if there's a sequence that has 7 email templates, which is sort of our standard. Okay, got it. Larry said that's correct. So one of the things that we'll do is we'll say, okay, in the first email, you should heavily personalize. And then it's kind of the Agoji model, right? You heavily personalize in the first email, and then you have sort of an automated follow-up email to that, because it gets that personalization that you've done so much work for. It gets that back in front of your prospect's eyes again. I'm a huge fan of bullet points. So, maybe in the first email, you have a few sentences. In the second email, you have like a shorter bump email. And then maybe the third email, you have just bullet points of pain that this person is experiencing, right? So you just have a different structure. And also that you don't want to be too repetitive in every single email. Like, we tend to write sequences as if they're all standalone, so you don't need to really, unless they're replies, but the new thread should be standalones. But you should also kind of assume that people are reading every one, even though they won't. Like, you want to write them as though everyone has standalone value that's also different and distinct from the other emails. So I think that's a good place to pause. I don't know, Megan, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, something we've also recently started doing internally is kind of straying away from those just generic bump after bump after bump. We want to try to add value, to Erika's point. So a generic bump, and then follow up with some value, and then maybe a call or two in there, a touch on LinkedIn, and then follow up with, another value driver, whether that's pains, to Erika's point, or whether that's a relevant ebook to persona, whether it's a webinar that might be of interest to the prospect. Just trying to drive value and share information, more of a consultative approach than just like a hard ask every single time as an email bump. Hey, checking in, do you have time to meet? Hey, just bumping my email again, do you have time to chat on Tuesday? We're kind of straying away from that model, more towards a drop a little of value in every single touch you have with the prospect.
Yeah, and I love that too. Another thing I thought of, Megan, as you were talking is, if you're prospecting salespeople, sometimes later on in the sequence, you can kind of reference, hey, like, I hope you appreciate my professional persistence, right? Like, I've seen that in a lot of team sequences, and sometimes that performs well. However, if you're prospecting like an engineer or, someone who's not a salesperson, they might just be like, no, I don't appreciate your professional persistence. And so that's probably not a good thing to say. So sometimes I call them process comments a lot. You can kind of comment on the process of the sequence that someone's in. I know that's been effective for some teams in the past, but it's not always. So you need to keep your persona in mind, and just kind of maybe for some other personas, you might say something like, hey, I've sent you a few emails. I don't want to be a bother, but I want to do my due diligence here. Like, I'm reaching out to you specifically because of this thing. So let me know if I'm off base. Like, I think that's a fair email to send later on in a sequence.
Absolutely.
So, crew, as we wind down here, Harold actually wrote something. I want to call it out. He says, if my team doesn't utilize my content, then I'm going to have a serious sit-down conversation with myself, right? As funny as that is, Harold must be a one-man band over there. But as funny as that is, in 30 seconds, we've talked a lot about team use, team creation, team whatever. But if we do have any of those sort of single power users out there they can create their own content. They're doing their own thing. What's one tip from both of you of someone who's like, I'm writing my own stuff, I'm out there making it happen, that if you give them that tip, it's going to help them move the needle, and then we'll round out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to double down on just using simple language. Like, don't overcomplicate it. Read an email out loud before you send it. If you wouldn't say, like, if you read your email out loud and you think there's no way I would say that to someone's face or on the phone, like, it's not a good email. So reading it out loud is really helpful, especially if you don't have someone writing content for you or a team to bounce ideas off of. So read it out loud and make sure that it makes sense as something you would say to someone.
That's a really good tip, Erica. For me, I think it would be to just know your audience, stick to a templated, the way you're kind of going to phrase all of your emails or all of your content. So if it's that first email, know that the structure is 2 sentences of personalization, your pains or your value prop, and then a call to action. And really just get comfortable in that so that you can utilize that template to really work with your own workflow. So one person writing all of the content, personalizing, that has to be tough. So just focus, the personalization, 1-2 sentences, and then keep the rest of the email something you can consistently use over and over to save time.
All right, thank you both for your tips. And I actually see a few more questions coming in, but we're right at time. So if you've put a question in, we'll make sure somebody follows up with you here after this webinar, okay? We're not going to leave you hanging. So with that, crew, that's all, folks. I've enjoyed chatting with you two ladies today. I think you did a great job. Thank you, Sales Hacker, for hosting this webinar and letting us be involved. And thank you for our audience being engaged, asking some questions along the way. So with that, we'll see you later. Stay out of trouble, and happy prospecting.
Bye.